Given your extensive work on issues of history and historical memory in post-war Austria, how would you characterize the contemporary situation? Did Austrian society confront the Nazi past, and regarding its role in the Holocaust, or is actually this period still as a kind of amnesic for Austria?
I think that we have to distinguish between different periods and different, so to say, also political and cultural periods of how people dealt with the past, Austria as state and Austria as society. The first question for me would be what are, so to say, the milestones for the transformation of Austrian memory? And I think there are several really crucial developments or even events which changed Austrian memory, but as a kind of general frame, we could say that these kinds of transformations are more or less similar to other parts of Europe, other countries, which on the one hand were occupied by the Nazis, but on the other hand, we have also, and firstly, to look at Germany. We know there were two German states, because Austria and Germany are, of course, the perpetrator state. So this is also the difference between Austria and Germany and other European countries. So if you look at the Austrian situation in this European framework, we can see so to say, a very short first period immediately after the war, where we really have something like, I think Anton Belinka coined this term, a kind of anti-fascist, so to say, attitude in most of the institutions, in most of the media, and so on and so forth. Of course, this is a time when the Allied forces were in Austria, the media were, so to say, reorganized under this umbrella. But this changed in 1948, 1949, with, so to say, these new laws, the Minderbelasteten amnesty, the 90% of the former members of the NSDAP, so to say, were released from all the consequences which were imposed on them in 1945. So that's the one, there are three aspects in this kind of transformation at the end of the 1940s. That's on the one hand, this kind of, so to say, 90% of former National Socialists now gained all the civil rights again, and especially the right to vote. That was not, they were, so to say, excluded from this right in 1945. The elections in 1949 were where all parties addressed this, of course, huge amount of voters which were, so to say, lying on the street now, and each party tried to get this support. And the third and more general aspect, of course, is the Cold War. So at this time, it was a kind of general assumption or a kind of leitmotif in political discourse, in media discourse, the enemy is on the left. And there was a kind of, so to say, just including more or less former National Socialists. They have to be included. Of course, it was clear that they couldn't stand outside of society for decades, but the question is, how were they included now? And we can see this transformation very clearly in the war monuments, which now came into being at the end of the 50s, end of the 40s, beginning of the 50s, and the kind of discourse which, so to say, tried to come to a kind of shared ground was, of course, the discourse concerning the fallen soldiers of the German Wehrmacht. And there you can find terms like honoring our heroes and thanking the ones who died for their homeland and so on and so forth. So this was a kind of signal or symbol, if you look at this kind of new topography of war monuments, for this new inclusion of this part of German nationalist, so to say, of a German nationalist heritage, we could say, in the way the Austrian society dealt with the fallen soldiers of the German Wehrmacht.
How do you interpret the causes of the recent rise of the extreme right wing, and can the avoidance of confrontation, displayed also in the Waldheim case, be seen as the main root of the normalization of extreme right wing agenda?
I'm doubting that there is a clear connection between these two phenomena. If you see, for example, it's a little bit different from the AfD in Germany and from, for example, the Freedom Party in Austria. In Germany, the AfD is clearly against this kind of culture of commemoration. In Austria, the Freedom Party was also, so to say, not very convinced that this is something worth to do. But when we came into government, you have this kind of what is the term for Widerspruch, of antagonism in this policy. On the one hand, you see the members of a government also taking part in this kind of commemoration ceremonies. Of course, you have the question, should they be included or not? At Mauthausen, it was not the case. But it's a kind of a double dog. And if you look at the Aula and other, so to say, media products of the Freedom Party and right-wing populists, so to say, camp, I don't know if camp is the right word, but so to say, how could we call it? I don't want to say movement, but this kind of political attitude. You can see that there is no real conviction of or real interest in being part of this culture of commemoration, which is also a sign of end of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st century. If you think of all these kinds of Holocaust memorial days, Holocaust museums, new ceremonies which came up at this turn of the century. In the year 2000, you have the Stockholm Declaration, the foundation of the IRA, and so on and so forth.
For example, it will be necessary to have Holocaust studies inside the university, talk really about genocide, and how you see the way how the society is actually dealing with this. What are the changes, if any?
Universities are really, so to say, institutions which have a strong continuity, and it's very, very hard to bring something new. If you look, for example, on the one hand, of course, compared especially to Germany or also to other parts of Europe and even beyond, there is, of course, a kind of, I dare to say lack, but it's clear that you do not have such strong institutions, for example, like the Institute for Zeitgeschichte in München, and like other institutions which are dealing with the Holocaust and with the Nazi time. That, of course, has to do with history. On the other hand, at the university itself, I don't think that is so different, because also universities are, in the first place, institutions for education of academics, for education especially of teachers. So you have this very strong disciplines, and you have in all of these institutes, you have people who are doing research on the Holocaust, not so much on other genocides, but they are very separated. There is not one strong institution. Of course, you have a Dokumentationsarchiv, but it is not a national institution. It doesn't have a financial support. The same with the Wiesenthal Institute. So if you look at these two institutions, they do not have this kind of resources, financial support to really become a strong institution. So that's, I would say, something which is really, there has to be done more, yeah? But on the other hand, if we talk about monuments, monuments are, we can say, are cheaper than an institution, because you build a monument, you unveil it, and then it's mostly done, yeah? Here it's interesting that Austria is really, so we could say, in the mainstream. If you look at the monument at Judenplatz, there is also a monument not so much known in the synagogue in the first district with all the names. You have now the question of a names monument, and Mali Drostenetz has been unveiled this year, sorry. Yeah. Yes.
But you still have, at least our research is showing, groups that now wants to map from which places in the city were people sent to the extermination camps, exist initiatives like IMA. Yeah, so and this was presented to us that actually is a self-organized initiative, because this work was not
that's
done.
not different. Our situation, for example, in Germany, you have in the 1980s, in 1990s, in all Europe, all over Europe, this kind of civil society movements, and the new culture of commemoration came out of these kinds of engagement of NGOs in Austria, in Germany, in other parts of Europe. So this is, I would say, a normal situation. And the state took over, for example, the very famous case of the Holocaust Memorial Monument in Berlin. You also have this initiative from the small, engaged people in the topography of terror, and then it became a state institution. And it's more or less the same, of course, with the state memorial days and so on and so far.
What will be the main event, if it's possible to use this word, or the moment in history to distinguish about what was going on before, that we can now talk about new commemoration processes or procedure, and what is the difference?
First of all, we also have to say that that's not only an Austrian, German, European, but also a kind of global with, I don't know what's the right, correct term, of Western civilization. Of course, in the Arab countries, it's obviously absolutely not the case. You can see these watersheds and the famous exhibition Monika Flacke did at the Deutsche Historische Museum. And the interesting question what you raise is, where were in each and every country the watershed events? In Austria, it was, of course, the Waldheim debate. You have the Historikerstreit in Germany. You have Rousseau with his Vichy syndrome publication. All of these happened in 1986, 1987, 1988. So you have this kind of transformation years, and the main, I would say, the main structure of this kind of transformation is a kind of changing perspective. Changing perspective from the nation state to society. And you can also use this terms externalization, internalization. These are still the valid terms to describe the situation. But if you look at the nation state, of course, victim theories are still valid. Yeah? If you would ask what is the situation in the academic discourse or in the historiographical discourse in Austria today, it's still this kind of distinction between the nation state and society. And on the level of a nation state, Austria was, of course, victim. For example, Gerhard Potts developed this kind of distinction as early as 1978. Yes, that's really interesting, but nobody really reacted to it, only 10 years later. But if you look at society, and that's of course the case all over Europe in all countries which were occupied or connected to Nazi Germany, or in general in dictatorships or totalitarian regimes, that means that all these kinds of crimes only had come into being with the support or with not doing something against, with no resistance in society.
When you were mentioning and making the division between Occident and, let's say, the Arab world, and then we have the former Eastern Europe part. Yeah. How and what is the place of former Eastern Europe that today it's part also of the European Union in all these discourses?
We have the situation that let's talk about the European Union. In the European Union, you have this kind of new culture of commemoration as something which develops in the 1990s and so on and so forth. And then you have 2004, yeah? When many Eastern countries, post-communist countries, became part of the European Union. And since then, you have this kind of divided commemoration culture. Of course, it has a clear, so to say, historical background. You have two dictatorships, so to say. You have two totalitarian regimes. How to deal with these kinds of double, so to say, memory? And that's still a crucial issue. You see it now in Poland, you see it in Hungary, you see it in all the issues of new museums which were done in the post-communist countries. And the overall question is how to compare without relativation. And that's something which is still going on. And this is still the hot, I would say this is the still conflicting issue in Europe. You see all this criticism on the House of Fates, on the Polish situation, and interestingly, I think, and of course the Baltic states, the only, so to say, political voice which is really a counter voice to the Holocaust commemoration is, as I could observe it, is in the Polish case. There you can have this political, so to say, statements against a culture of shame, as it's called, and we have now to develop a culture of pride on our national history. You have the memory loss, which is really extremely problematic for historical research. You have very overwhelming museums, like the Museum of Warsaw Uprising. So this is really, I would say, a counter position which is defined, especially in Poland, because with this kind of political declarations against Holocaust commemoration.
Is the memory of the Holocaust somehow separated from the mainstream discourse of interpreting the Nazi past in terms of Austria as well as in the context of Eastern Europe?
In the context of Austria and in general, I would say the Holocaust commemoration has become, so to say, the point of reference. You cannot talk about, so to say, the fallen soldiers in the Austrians, which became part of the German Wehrmacht, as it was the case in the post-war decades. You cannot talk about this without talking about the Holocaust. Of course, you can say there are also, or observe that there are also kind of trying to counter this, I would say, this overaging commemoration point. And this is, for example, the Identitären. They tried just to re-invoke this very, so to say, a very strong but now nearly important position in Austrian memory, and that is looking at the wars against the Osmans and the Turks and so on and so forth. You know, 1683 and Kahlenberg, and I think since then, only a few years ago, it started with the march to the Kahlenberg in September, to honor, so to say, the fight of Christianity against the Osmanic Empire.
How much in these discourses that are changing, actually they are depending on the changes in capitalism, let's say from liberalism, because you talk about the 80s and many emphasize the 80s was a kind of decade where these changes happened. From a historical point of view, what was actually the condition? What was the other processes that led to this kind of being the 80s, the big change from one side of memory to another format and so on?
If you just try to ask what changed, which changes and transformation occurred in society in this period, in the 1980s, 1990s, of course you have liberalism, neoliberalism, so to say, the wild capitalism, which was not only the case in the East, but also shaped the West at least. Of course, you have one of the main transformations is so to say, the crumbling of the big political camps, and also the narratives. Also the narratives concerning the past of these political camps, conservatives, social democrats, they just lost importance. And if you, for example, would look at the 1980s, you have not only on the national level, but also in the level of provinces, party publications, newspapers of the Social Democrats, the Conservatives, even of the Communist Party. All these kinds of medias have vanished very quickly in the 1990s. If you, for example, think about the Social Democratic Arbeiterzeitung, which was that traditional newspaper, it just, all these kinds of voices vanished. That means society, all these kinds of belonging to a social, cultural, political, so to say, strata in society, they have just lost importance. And you have now a very individualized and not, so to say, not politicized in the way as you think of party politics as it was before. You can also see that some talking about, or my question would be, if we would say that the Holocaust is now the main point of reference for looking at the past of the 20th century, what kinds of points of historical reference have lost, so to say, have lost importance, have lost social energy, have lost, so to say, their place in cultural imagination. Yeah? And there are clear losers. One of the most important transformations is the decline of the memory for resistance. And that was, of course, in the foreground in the post-war decades. Only of a very small part of Austrian society. But if you would talk what is the antagonism in post-war Austria, it is on the one hand the commemoration of the fallen soldiers, which was dominant in the, so to say, in the provinces, in each village, each small town, you have this kind of monument. And on the other hand, the commemoration for resistance against the Nazi regime, and this was predominantly, so to say, in the culture of social democrats, of course the communists, not so much or even merely not existing in the conservative milieu, because there this kind of commemoration for the fallen soldiers was in the foreground. And now you have these kinds of antagonism has also vanished. And you have the second point why the history for the resistance just lost influence and lost also its former place in cultural memory is also, so to say, general transformation from an heroic to a victim-orientated memory. And of course, the heroic memory of resistance was coined by this kind of pathos of post-war decades. It had, so to say, a history. Holocaust memory had no history and could now act in a completely new way of discourse, of rituals, and so on and so forth. If I want to think about, just try to get the idea, what would historians in 50 or 100 years ask when we look, or critically ask when we look at our culture of commemoration, or which questions they would raise? I think one question could be, why did it become so important to identify with a completely innocent victim? Is it, so to say, a kind of symbolic identification with a kind of group which did not do anything because they could not do anything, or mostly did not do anything? They were not persecuted because of what they did, but because of what they were. And if I identify with a completely innocent, but also completely a victim group without agency, so to say, and every agency was under the umbrella of under the framework of a Nazi persecution, it gives me, so to say, the freedom that I also do not have to act. So there is no kind, what is the action, what is the message? That's of course fighting against anti-Semitism, fighting against racism, but you have not this kind of, so to say, fighting against the authoritarian state, or fighting against all these kinds of, or doing something, yeah? In the sense of identifying with somebody who really acted as a partisan, for example. So I think that's the ambivalence. The question is not what is the outcome, what is it, so to say, what does this mean? But the question is, why did it become so attractive and important?
Also, the question that is of our interest is if it's possible to see a difference between memory and history. If in terms that if it's a change in memory, that the memory is from the state coming to be part of the civil society, of individual memory of groups, and then history on the other part is actually now delegated back to the state or institutional framework. Is possible to think about this difference, or what is this difference includes?
I would come back to the question, what is the framework for these kinds of changes we just are talking about. And of course, one of the main aspects is that the concept of future vanished. Pierre Nora, he speaks about an obsession of society for memory. But what you can see is, if you look, for example, in the 1970s, on historiography of the 1986 generation, you have a clear idea of a better future. More democratic, more equal, more social security for more people, and so on and so forth. More participation, these kind of leitmotif of democratization of society. The idea of a better future has vanished. And we can really, if we want to think about what are the, so to say, what is this kind of connected developments at the end of the 20th century, this is of course one of the most important developments in cultural and in societal imagination, that you only have negative, dystopian ideas of the future, and not this idea which is, so to say, the basis of the 1970s and the 1960s, the future is bright. This has really changed. And of course, if you just think that in the 1970s, I think in Bremen, there was a there was the idea to just skip history from the school curriculum and replace it by sociology. So this was the idea that history is not so important. And who did this kind of commemoration and heritage stuff? Not commemoration, it's this kind of culture and heritage. That was, of course, on the agenda of the conservatives, and not of, so to say, progressive or reform-orientated parts of society.
We would like to know your opinion on the House of Austrian History, that it's a monumental effort to have the 100 years of the Second Republic of Austria actually really from that historical moment until today put on such a prominent space and also cementing in a certain way or being open to many of these discourses.
Point is that it's a very late founding. If you look at Germany or other places, at Brussels, and in Germany you now have a development that each of the federal provinces in Bavaria, I've heard of other places, are now starting to build their own house of history. So on the one hand, it's very late. On the other hand, and of course, you know all these kind of political discussions. It was discussed in 1945 or even since 1918. And the idea, and I think that's why it's very necessary, is to have a place where memory and history and conflicting positions can be discussed. And to have a permanent, so to say, place of discussion for the future also, yeah? So you have no institutional frame where these kinds of observing how history develops, how memory, so to say, changes can be done. And it's of course a very necessary institution, and of course it's underfinanced and it has not enough space, but you know all these discussions.
There is one interesting kind of moment, and this is the bringing inside the discourse Austrofascism and what is actually this Nazi regime. So from a historical point of view, what is that we can learn from now making this part of such presentation, and also what is actually the function of this Austrofascism that seems that was pushed in the past and today again by others are presented as a key point to understand that whole period.
Simply saying, are there any major differences between Austrofascism and National Socialism?
Just one step beyond. If you have been there, you could see that there is room for starting in 1918, and then you have just clusters. And the only part of the exhibition which is connected to specific historical periods is 1933 to 1938 and 1938 to 1945. And that gives you the impression, the right impression, that these are the crucial periods of history of Austrian society which are still important for the present. So they have to have a place there. And of course, I would just pose the question in a different way. If you look at Austrian memory since 1945, the question of Austrofascism was in the foreground, because it was also a kind of a result of a victim theory. 1938 to 1945 was not part of Austrian history. Nobody, and even the 1968 historians did not deal with this period, or only with the resistance. That was, so if we ask what is the contribution of 1968, the left contemporary historians, the leftists, so to say, it is to bring back resistance into the national, so to say, national historical narrative. That is one thing. The other thing is that If there was an Austrian Historikerstreit, it was of course on Austrofascism. And you know, even to use the term is a conflicting issue. So until the Waldheim debate, this was the hot, so to say, the hot period in Austrian history and also memory. But after Waldheim, it just switched, of course, to 1938 to 1945. And of course, in a way, I would say, it's still a hot issue, and there are still debates. And I know that I was asked, I don't know how many times, with university groups and colleagues, why didn't you use the term Austrofascism? So we see there is a kind of discussion, but I would say it's a very important, but it's not, so to say, the social energy which still gains a kind of inspiration from this discussion. And of course we know that there is huge difference, in, not to talk about this kind of dictatorship and totalitarian Nazi regime, and of course the Holocaust and the crimes which were done. But it's still a kind of hot history and hot memory, and still raises discussions, and I think that's fruitful.
Memory is, in our research case, we connected with amnesia. So we talk about amnesia, but recently from colonials, post-colonial studies like Anne-Laura Stoller, they are talking about aphasia. That process, it's not so amnesic, but is actually like missing the words for things that are known. So the question that will be from our side is, do you think in the concept of memory that you are working historically is possible to see a certain genealogy, or post-memory, it's also a term? What and how to think about these changes?
The issue of the right words and expressions, I would support this. You could, for example, see it in the case of the Holocaust. You had to find new terms to talk about it. And one of the most interesting aspects in dealing with the history and the memory of the Holocaust, and that's also surprising on the scholarly level, is that this was not in the foreground even in historiography, as we know, yes? So one of the interesting, so to say, aspects in looking at the 20th century is to raise the question, why has a historical, so to say, moment which is now, so to say, not only in the history of the 20th century, but in the history of mankind, coined as Zivilisationsbruch, as we know. A term, we speak about aphasia, a term Dandina coined in 1988, and now it's general. It expresses the general attitude, the general way the 20th century is commemorated, and that it was not in, that it didn't have this place in history, especially not in history and in memory, until the 1980s. If you look at the translation history and the publishing history of Hilberg's iconic book, and how long it took that it could be published and that it was translated. So this is really an extremely interesting question, to have this kind of so to say, from no place to their place in history and memory.
Okay, and you have already mentioned that the concept of the future has vanished. So, speaking of future, how do you conceptualize it?
If you look at the whole concept of memory, one point, and I come back to this term of obsession, is that this, so to say, there is a famous article, you know it of course, by Jan Assmann in 1988. This is a founding article of the concept of memory in the German-speaking academic world. And he, at the end, he writes to be informed what a society wants and how it conceptualizes itself. You have to look at how it deals with its memory. Now we would say with its traumatic memory. If you, 10 years before, you would have said, if you want to know what a society wants and how it sees itself, you would look at the way it imagines its future. So this is really for me a very, very strong, so to say, change in perspective or switch from the orientation to the future to the orientation to the past, in the sense that you get, so to say, a moral ground and an ethic ground. That is now the resource which you, the past is now the resource for the ethical and moral foundation of societies, not the future.
This possibility to go back in the past is, in a way, an effort or an effect of also technologies that could retrieve and first document, second, that it's enough gap in terms of judicial elements that many archives are open, so this also influence this term.
The archives, of course, became open in the post-communist countries. It was extremely complicating to do research, for example in Auschwitz-Birkenau, but now everything became or started to become open. And that's, of course, something very crucial, and it became a connected history. If you would research on deportation, for example, you have to look, of course, at the archives in Riga, in Theresienstadt, and so on and so forth. So history became or historical research, of course, became a big kind of motivation to look at these new sources. And if you just think about the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, Yad Vashem, and so on and so forth, they all went to these, to collect sources from the archives which were now accessible. Yeah?